I'm going to hit record, and then I'm going to start. There you go. So my name is Patty Konstantakis, and I'm the Director of Adult Learning Initiatives at Digital Promise. And welcome to what is now, a monthly webinar series from our Adult Learning Initiative. And couple of things logistically, and then I'll introduce our guest for today. Kind of as I said earlier, I'm recording this, so folks can, if you know of people who haven't, who were unable to make it, we can send them the link, etc. In fact, actually, the better thing to say is that I will, after this webinar, and probably tomorrow, we will send out just a follow-up quick email to everybody that was registered that will have the link to this webinar, and then also contact information for Katie Nielsen, our guest, and also any resources, et cetera, that she has for us. So I will send that out as we go. Lastly, I think most of you maybe hopefully are familiar with Zoom, but we'll use the chat features. Sorry, I hope you guys can't hear that. I may have to mute myself because they're doing something with tiles outside my window. So most of you, what we'll do is use the chat feature here to ask questions, although it may be that we're a small enough group that, ultimately, if you've got a question and we want to elaborate on it, we may just, say unmute yourself and go ahead and jump in. But feel free to ask questions along the way. Katie will probably stop and actually allow for questions, and please feel free to jump in and ask and make this as interactive as possible. But so yeah. Welcome. So with that, let me tell you a little bit about what this webinar is about. So we at Digital Promise, some of you know, some of you don't, are really concerned with, one of our main focuses is on research. We kind of take two perspectives on that. One is, how is it that we really use what we know about learning from learning science and integrate that into the design of our ed tech products. We care a lot about that, and we do a lot of that kind of work at Digital Promise. And then the flip side of that is that as we're implementing ed tech and products, we're also very concerned with continuing kind of that the evaluation and the research around efficacy around with products. And so Katie brings experience in both. And so I asked her to join us in this webinar, and she's going to tell us some about her experiences with implementing research-based technology programs, specifically in kind of workplace, in a workplace kind of context. So with that, I will hand it over to Katie, and I will unshare here just a second. Oops, let me stop sharing.
Thank you, Patty. And I just want to reiterate to everyone that I really do want to make this as interactive as possible. So, and there aren't very many people here, so please interrupt me if you have questions. And also interrupt me if I am going too fast, or if you don't understand me, or if I'm boring. What you guys can help shape this presentation. I'm trying to move the Zoom controller so that I can actually start the PowerPoint presentation.
I had the same problem earlier.
Here we go. So you guys should be able to see my screen, yes?
Yes.
Okay. Implementing research-based technology programs in workforce language training. It's so exciting. And I'm very excited to be with all of you this morning, which is, for me, a snowy morning in New York City. Just to give you a little bit of information about who I am, I'm the Chief Education Officer at Voxy, which is a web and mobile-based language learning platform that's designed to teach needs-based English to learners all over the world. But before this, I worked as a research scientist at the University of Maryland for years, doing research on the efficacy of all of the technology-mediated language training products the US government was using across mostly the intelligence community for language instruction. And I also worked as an assistant professor. I've been teaching English as a second language since I was a volunteer on an apple orchard with Mexican migrant workers when I was 20. So I've been on both sides of the classroom. I've been a teacher trainer, and I've also done a lot of work building custom language courses for different clients, many of whom were based in workplace settings. So I have a lot of practical experience and research-based experience on how to use technology for language learning to make it more effective and efficient. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about what we know about language learning and technology, and then talk about how to do a needs analysis in a workforce language training program and build a language learning strategy, and then end with how to measure outcomes. Because the most important thing, and what Patty talked about at the beginning, is that any program you implement have clear key performance indicators so that you know that it's working. Because learning a language under the best case scenario is a long and costly endeavor. And if you're going to set up a program, you want to make sure that the program is going to work. So a little bit about language learning. Learning a language is learning a new skill. It's not studying a content area. And it's important to talk about this because it's often approached like teaching a content area. Like, I'm going to teach everybody the basics: apple, banana, book, ball, airplane. And then they're going to be able to speak English, and then they can learn to do whatever it is they need to do in English. And that's just not how it works. Adults learn by doing. Learning a language is learning a skill, and we should approach language training the same way we approach other skills-based instruction. Now, over the last few centuries, the way language is taught has changed. So in the 1600s, we thought that the best way to teach languages was through grammar translation, which we know doesn't work. Then there have been lots of other approaches to language instruction, but in the last 30 years, most of them have centered around the idea of communicative language teaching, which means that you teach people to communicate in the language, because fundamentally, a language is a tool that we use to communicate. And it's also a tool that we use to accomplish real-world tasks. And that's why thinking about language instruction this way works so well for workplace training programs, because adults aren't just learning a language because they think it's cool. They're learning a language, and in this case, in the United States, most of them are learning English because they need to use English to do something. And if we can figure out what it is they need to be able to do, then we can teach them the right thing. If you ask a group of researchers on anything how something works, you're going to get many different opinions, most of which are backed up by research, and everybody has tiny differences in how they think everything should be done. That said, if you distill the last, probably, it says 30 years, but it's probably 50 years of research on how language learning works, of course there are going to be differences, but even people at polar opposite ends of the second language acquisition spectrum agree that you need 4 things for language learning to work. And if you don't have those 4 things, you're not going to be able to do it. So when you're thinking about how to teach language in your workplace, how to build a program, find a program, you need to make sure it has input, which is lots and lots of examples of the language that people need to be able to use, either written or recorded for them to listen to. They need to be able to produce the language themselves. So they need the opportunity for output, speaking and writing. On top of that, they need to be able to interact. It's not enough just to like sit around and produce language by yourselves. You have to talk to another person needs to read your emails. You need to be involved with another person who's responding to what you're saying. And you need feedback. And you need the kind of feedback that's, wait, you got the sentence right or wrong. And you also need interactional feedback. Learners need to say something to a conversation partner and then look at the puzzled look on that person's face and realize what they've said was not what they meant to say. That's all part of the language learning process. And these are all things that nearly everyone who does research on how language learning works would agree on. So that's the basics of language. Now let's talk about technology, because while we've been figuring out all these things about how people learn languages, we've also been doing a lot of work on how to make technology-mediated instruction effective. A lot of people approach using technology like, here's some cool new tool, I want to use this to teach. And what we know is that's completely backwards. What you want to do is solve existing problems using technology so that you can improve the way instruction works and improve efficacy and efficiency and outcomes. For language learning, what you want to do to use all of those, to get all those 4 pillars, input, output, interaction, and feedback, you want to use a blended approach. So you want to use technology to do what software can do best, so people can do what humans do best, because we can't take humans out of language instruction. So when you're setting up language instruction for adult learners in a workplace or preparing them to go into a workplace, self-study materials that don't involve any sort of human interaction are going to be insufficient. What can technology do best? It can do a lot of awesome things. So it's good to think about what those things are. The first thing that you can do with technology is individualize instruction. Now, everybody knows that individualized instruction is better. That's why working with a private tutor is better than sitting in a class with 30 people and one teacher. Why is that? Because everybody learns at a different pace. People are going to have different questions. They're going to have different strengths and weaknesses. This is true in any educational context. It's especially true when you're talking about teaching somebody a skill. You can't take a classroom full of people and teach them how to ride a bike by giving them a lecture on bike riding and expect them to go out and be able to do it. And then when they go to do it, they're all going to have different problems. And it's the same thing with learning a language. So what technology does is it lets you help people where they need help the most. Give them content that's relevant and interesting to their needs. Give them feedback where they need the most help. Technology can also streamline reporting for better decisions. So if you have a language learning program and it's very black boxy, you send students to a classroom with a teacher and you think that they're sitting there and you think that they're learning, but you don't have any way of measuring how much they're paying attention, where they have questions, where they're struggling. If learners are interacting with a web-based tool and you collect data on all of the areas where they're struggling or have questions, then you get a better idea of who's learning, who's not learning, and what they need. So technology can always help you streamline reporting for better decisions, and it can help you streamline reporting so that you know who needs more training and who needs less training. Technology solves issues of space and time. This is another huge issue for adult learners in general, because getting them to attend a physical class is often a problem. That's why people turn to online instruction. You just want to make sure that your online instruction is set up for success, which means it needs to include an element of face-to-face virtual instruction with autonomous practice. And that's one of the benefits of technology. People can meet with a teacher, they can meet with a subject matter expert, they can meet with a conversation partner, they can practice having job interviews, they can do all those things from the comfort of their own phone or their own computer on their own schedule. Another thing technology can do that's especially important for language learning is offer rich, scaffolded input. What does that mean? It means we want to teach people language using authentic materials, because you don't want to teach them fake English. You don't want to teach them, and this is an actual dialogue from an actual commercial language learning product. And it says, are you selling fish? I am selling fish. I would like to buy fish. That's what you often find in commercial language materials that are designed to teach language. Now, that is a useless dialogue. First of all, nobody would ever say those things if they were going to buy fish. You would never say, are you selling fish? Because the person is probably standing behind a counter full of fish. So you might say, what's fresh today? Or is that salmon farm raised? Or do you have 25, 30 count shrimp? But you would never say, are you selling fish? But that's the kind of material that you often find in one size fits all language textbooks, language programs, and it's not teaching the right thing. When you give somebody a real dialogue, though, you're not going to be able to control the language as much. Probably the are you selling fish, I'm selling fish dialogue comes because it's simple. We repeat the word fish over and over again. If someone's asking about farm-raised salmon, that's more complex, which is why you can use technology to add glosses, to give people extra information, to show a picture of the fish next to the farm-raised salmon. That's one of the benefits of using technology. Technology can also give learners access to tools. So they can have flashcards with all of the keywords that they need. I somehow got muted, but I think I'm unmuted now. Technology can give learners access to tools so that they can have flashcards of all the keywords they need to remember before they go on a job interview. So they can go back and review where they learned words and see them in context. And technology can offer authentic experiences. One of the best things we can do with technology is incorporate language learning into the things people already have to do. So they can listen to music in English. They can set their GPS to give them directions in English to go places where they already need to go. They can record themselves having conversations in English and then bring those recordings to have a conversation with a teacher about what they said and what the other person said. That's one of the richest things that you can do with technology. And they can be integrated into daily activities. People use technology to do everything. They're on LinkedIn, they're in Google Docs, they're having Skype conversations, they are using WhatsApp. And if they're doing those things in English, then they get the real world practice that they need. And many of those things relate to things they need to do on the job. So I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions before I keep going, just because I've been giving this monologue and maybe somebody would like to know something, disagree with something, ask for clarification. I maybe hear someone typing. Is there anything in the chat box? No, just Patty saying, feel free to use this to ask questions.
I know, just me saying that. Yeah.
Okay, I'll keep going, but please do stop me if you guys have questions about anything. So the beginning part of the presentation was to go over sort of the theory behind how to use technology for language learning and what we do. Okay, great, sorry. What we know about language learning and technology and how we can use those together. So the next thing I want to talk about is a needs analysis. Because if you want to develop a language learning program for workforce development, for adult learners in a workplace, you need to do a needs analysis first and come up with a strategy. So the needs analysis is simple, and it sounds very simple when I say this, but it very rarely happens. The first question is, who needs to learn English? The next question is, why are they learning it? What materials do they need to read, and what tasks do they need to complete? If you focus on just teaching people what they need, it works a lot better, because they're going to see right away that the language training is helping them with their lives, because they are going to be motivated to learn the language you're teaching them, because they're going to get the real world practice they need if you're using authentic materials and authentic tasks. So this should be the first step in establishing a program. It's also going to help you measure your success, because if you know who needs to learn English, why they're learning it, and what materials they need, you'll be able to see at the end if they're able to do those things. Instead of using scripted, outdated learning materials, teach English with the materials that learners need. This is what I was getting at before when I was talking about that ridiculous dialogue about buying fish. And it makes a lot of sense. And the best part about working with adults is that there are real materials they need. You just need to figure out what they are and let them have practice using them. So when you're building your strategy, there are a few more questions you need to answer. What level should employees reach? How much time do they have? Where will they learn? Who will manage their learning? Can you offer an incentive? Should you offer an incentive? And what are your metrics for success? And the metrics for success are super, super important. But it's worth talking about some of these other key questions, because not every employee needs to reach the same level. First of all, they're going to be at different levels anyway, and different job tasks, different roles, different goals that learners have are going to mean they have different requirements for their ultimate proficiency level. Someone who wants to be able to answer questions from his or her boss at work doesn't necessarily need to have impeccable written grammar. Somebody who wants to get into an English for Academic Purposes program at a community college and get out of that and enroll and matriculate in the community college is going to need to have better grammar in order to write papers. There are different needs. But you don't want to approach teaching English as a one-size-fits-all, because it's not going to work. So here are 5 things that we know are going to improve learner outcomes. We know that personalized courses improve learner outcomes. We know using 100% authentic content improves outcomes. We know that virtual live instruction does too. Here's a really interesting statistic. When I talk to workplaces that are getting ready to offer language programs, many of them have some kind of language instruction that they offer. They bring teachers in and people attend classes during the day. The cancellation rate that they report for those live classes is upwards of 50%. So they pay teachers to come to teach people who 50% of the time don't show up. I looked at live virtual instruction with 10,000 students over the past year, and the no-show rate was 10%. 90% of the time, if students book an appointment online, they show up and they have the class. So just making sure that learners aren't canceling classes is a huge way of making sure that your live instruction has better outcomes. Automated assessment is another thing that can help improve outcomes. First of all, it makes sure that the learners are learning. And second of all, it saves teacher time. So one of the things that happens when you're offering instruction with teachers is that they spend all their time looking for resources, assessing students, writing materials. If you can get rid of those parts of the training program and just have your teachers working with students on teaching them and helping them with their productive practice, giving them feedback on pronunciation and on their speaking skills, then you are being much more efficient and probably spending the dollars that you have on these programs more wisely. And then reporting, because we have to know it works. Investing in something like teaching someone a language without being able to measure the effectiveness of it is crazy, because if you're using something, if you're sending students to a program or you've paid for access to software for them and you can't measure whether or not it's working, you have no idea if you're spending your dollars that you probably don't have an unlimited amount of wisely. Then you want to make sure that the courses are aligned to employees' needs and jobs. So here I've been doing a lot of work talking to various workforce development programs, and there's a huge need for home health aides to get the English that they need to do their jobs, for workers in the food services to get the English they need to do their jobs, for construction workers. Here are examples of some courses that we've actually put together at my company that take real world materials that people need in those various industries. OSHA videos for the construction workers and also for the food service workers, guides on dispensing medicine, the types of contracts that home health aides have to sign with the people for whom they're providing care. We've taken all of those and turned them into actual lessons so people get the English they need to do those tasks. I wanted to give you guys an example of a needs analysis that I did 8 or 9 years ago. I was working with Casa de Maryland, which is an immigrant rights organization serving the legal and educational needs of people throughout the state of Maryland. And so they offered free English classes at night for people all over the state who would come for 2 hours, 4 days a week and take they weren't free, but they were very inexpensive. And they were using really outdated textbooks to teach everybody the same thing. And they knew that the program wasn't working. And so they asked me and a couple of other people affiliated with the University of Maryland at the time to do some work for them and figure out what was wrong with their program. So what we did was a needs analysis. We conducted focus group interviews with all of the students. We distributed hundreds of surveys in English, Spanish, and French, and we identified learners' needs to figure out what it was they wanted to be able to do in English. Now, the books they were using were teaching them how to read train schedules, how to introduce themselves, how to describe clothing. What the learners actually wanted to be able to do was read official letters in English, communicate with police during vehicle stops, communicate with their bosses, understand doctors' diagnoses, read legal documents, read the instructions on medicines and vaccines, get a driver's license, attend job interviews, talk to representatives from my bank when there's a problem with my account, understand radio and television, ask for directions, ask for information about things I would like to buy in a store or a department store. None of that stuff was in any of the language training materials they were using. So it was a wonderful resource that was being provided to all of these working adults who were coming to class at night after they'd been at their jobs all day long. And they were spending 2 hours every night and they weren't learning anything they needed to learn. So the results of this needs analysis were supposed to have been used to help improve the training materials. I think that happened to some extent afterwards, but it was just very eye-opening that people are going to programs and they're not getting the English that they need. So when you're evaluating a product to decide whether or not you want to use it, you want to ask these questions. Is the language authentic? Do learners have time to practice? Are they getting feedback on error? Is the instruction personalized? What are the learning outcomes and what are our metrics for success? It looks like there might be some questions in the chat box. Are there questions? If not, I can pause for some.
Yeah, there are. I can. Some of them are related specifically to what you're doing. Some others, it might be something you're getting to a little bit later. I can either show them to you. You can read them really quickly, and we can figure out whether you want to answer them now or you want to keep going and come back to them.
I'll take a look. So strategies to encourage and help teachers to use online reporting. Okay, suggest studies that show how integrating technology has a positive impact on adult learning. Yeah, I can talk about that at the end. Yes, and it is true. Talking about your job in English versus doing your job in English. So, okay, I'm gonna keep going through the presentation the way it is, and then at the end I will talk about some of the data that we have around how integrating technology in classes has a positive impact on adult learning.
Yep.
Okay, so measuring outcomes. Keep talking about it. But what outcomes do you measure? How do you measure the effectiveness of language training? We've done a lot of research, and actually this framework for evaluating the success of a distance language learning course comes out of a paper that I presented at the Georgetown University Roundtable about 3 years ago. So is there a question? Maybe not. And there are 4 ways that will give you a really comprehensive view of whether or not your language learning program is working. The first one is time on task. So we know that time on task is the single biggest predictor of success in learning any skill, assuming that you're spending time on the right tasks. But the more time you spend practicing, the better you're going to be. So just measuring how much time learners are spending is super important. Another reason why measuring time on task is important with technology-mediated instruction is because we don't actually have good benchmarks for how much time people need to spend in face-to-face instruction. When people compare engagement and time on task in online courses with face-to-face courses, it's really like they're comparing apples with like imaginary oranges. Because just because people go to a classroom and sit in the room and look at the teacher doesn't mean they're paying attention, doesn't mean they don't have questions, doesn't mean they're learning anything. So what we really need to do is measure how much time people are spending in any kind of online training to get good benchmarks for how long it takes to accomplish various tasks after various amounts of training. So time on task, one way of measuring success. Another one is just measuring language and content. So looking at proficiency improvement over time, looking on performance at end of unit achievement tests, looking at ongoing instructor feedback. Those are all ways of making sure that learners are both improving their overall language proficiency, but also improving on what we're teaching them. You want to look at 360 satisfaction. So you want the sponsoring organization to be happy with the language program. You want the learners to be happy. You want teachers to be happy. And then the most important thing when you're talking about the success of a language learning program, especially a language learning program intended for adults who have real needs, is real world success. Learners should be able to accomplish their real world tasks after the program is over, because that's why we're teaching them in the first place. And this piece of measuring outcomes is often missing from programs. But when you're sitting down, you have a workplace, you want to teach people English, you need to set up a training program for them. Making sure you start with a needs analysis so you know what you want to teach, and then make sure you hold the language program you're working with accountable for these metrics. Making sure people are engaged, that they're learning, that they like it, and that they can do something with it afterwards. So I've taken some data from my platform because I have it available to me to give you an example, to give you just some visuals of how you can report this, what kind of reporting you should expect from any technology tools you work with. This was comparing learners who used Voxy as a standalone tool. So they were adults who weren't using any live instruction, which, as I said before, is going to lead to incomplete language learning, but I had some who didn't use any live instruction. And I compared it to a published study with one of our competitors. And you can see that by the end of the 3rd month, we still had 30% of the learners who were doing this all autonomously still engaged with the platform, which was 30 times what our competitor was showing. So one of the reasons that we measured this is because we wanted to know what kind of engagement levels we could expect without teachers motivating students to use the platform. And this is what you see. And this is what you want any commercial product you work with to show you. You want to know what the level of engagement you should expect is. You also want to know if people are actually learning English. So I have a proficiency assessment that's built into my platform so that I can understand learners from all different groups, what their starting proficiency is and what their ending proficiency is. And this goes and shows that on average, 84% of beginners improve a level after 14 hours, 91% of high beginners improve. And then once you get to the intermediate levels, it takes longer. So you would see 30% of learners improving a level after about 34 hours and 65% of them improving within a level. So improving their score, but not improving their entire level. Again, whatever program you work with, whatever tool you use should be reporting to you what learners' proficiency improvement over time looks like. And also it should show you if learners are learning what you teach them. You want to collect, you want any product you use, any program you use to tell you that the customers are satisfied with it. and that the learners themselves are satisfied with it. And as I said, you want to collect real world success. So I have some examples here of my learners who have gone into graduate school, gotten letters from their bosses saying that their English is now sufficient to have new job tasks. I had somebody 2 weeks ago who sent me screenshots of a chat she was having with customer service at Walmart when she needed to return something that she'd bought in English. And she was so excited that she had the English skills she needed to figure out how to return what she'd purchased. So that piece is incredibly important to demonstrating the effectiveness of a language program that's designed to teach people to accomplish their real world goals. Okay, so let's recap. We need to understand how language learning works, which we talked about. The technology that you use should add value and it should solve a problem. So it shouldn't just be technology for technology's sake. It should be technology because it helps make instruction more effective. Instruction should always be based on the institutional needs and also on learners' needs. And a needs analysis can help you define an overall strategy for how to approach language learning. You have to be able to get information on learner outcomes because everybody needs to pay attention. So the most important thing about learning, or the most critical ingredient to learning a language, is paying attention. What I'm doing right now, lecturing at you guys without any interruption and just going on and on and on, is the worst way to teach anybody anything. You can be sitting at your desk, listening to me, checking in and out, thinking, wow, she's still talking. And you can think, did I remember to turn the stove off this morning? What do I need to get at the store when I'm done working today? Oh, wait, that lady, she's still talking about language learning. And if you're a native English speaker, you can probably tune back in and pick up where you left off and get some idea of what I'm talking about. But if you were trying to learn English right now and you weren't a native English speaker and you stopped paying attention for 1 second, it would be incredibly difficult for you to pick back up where you left off. But that's what we ask language learners to do all the time when we put them in programs where we ask them to read materials and listen to materials that aren't interesting to them. They don't pay attention and they don't learn. Asking adults to learn a language is one of the most difficult things we ask them to do. And so if we want to design a program that's maximized for your return on your investment, for the success of your learners, for your learner satisfaction, it should be designed around giving them real practice with the authentic tasks they need to accomplish in English. That's sort of what I had, but I think we have some questions that I can answer now.
Yeah, I think there's probably several. Why don't you start back with a couple of the ones that David Rosen asked, which was, can you think about some strategies to encourage and help teachers use online reporting, for example? So you just talked about this reporting. I feel like a lot of people, and David says this, but others have experienced that there is not that much, a lot of adult education teachers really don't have a lot of training and practice in working with these kinds of reports and these kinds of technologies.
Right. And so any kind of reporting that asks teachers to do the manual labor is also not very good, because that's just giving teachers one more thing to do. So as far as reporting goes, what works well is to look for tools that will automatically track what learners are doing and basically give reports to teachers and administrators aggregated around the metrics that their teachers and administrators want, if that makes sense. So something that requires that teachers manually go into a grade book and keep track of what students have done. I mean, that's good for keeping track of what's happening in classrooms, but it's just like one more thing that you want your teachers to do. Whereas if you have students using an online tool and the online tool has logins and passwords and tracks what learners are doing, all those data should be available for teachers and administrators. They don't have to do the work themselves.
Sure. So, so go beyond that a little bit too, and talk about, okay, they are looking at a report that a product gives them. Like, what are the kinds of things? So you talked about engagement. You're like, talked about looking at time on task for that. Are there some other things that are great strategies for sort of really looking at learning?
So one thing to do is look and see what learners have done, because what we know also from all of this research on distance learning is learners don't do things if they don't think you're paying attention to them. So if you assign them homework and they have no idea that you're checking it, they stop doing it. I mean, you see this with second graders. My second grader once saved 3 months of homework in one of his dresser drawers. And when I found it, he said the teacher just puts it in a box and she never checks it. So I decided I didn't need to do it. And that's what happens with adults too. But if you look at what they're doing online and you bring back tiny insights to the classroom afterwards, we see over and over again that it drives engagement. And you can build your classes around what learners have done offline. So you can see where people are struggling, you can see where they have questions, you can see, okay, nobody in the class is understanding this concept, or people spent 5 times as long reading this article as this article, so let's talk about this article when we come to class. It gives you things to do to A, make them know you're paying attention to what they do when they're not in the classroom, and B, to design the classroom around where people are struggling outside. Did that help? Is that sort of getting at the answer to that?
I think so.
And as far as studies go that show how integrating technology in classes has a positive impact on adult learning. So the Department of Education did a meta-analysis, I think, now it was probably 10 years ago, looking at every study that had been published up until then that used, you're nodding, Patty, do you know the study?
I do. Yeah, go ahead.
That looked at anything that used distance learning, blended learning across all contexts. So it was K-12, higher ed, adult learning, it was everything. And the main finding was that integrating technology is helpful and blended programs are helpful because people have more time on task. And it's true. And so I will actually share after the webinar there, I can think of, I don't have the references at the top of my head, but there are a few recent studies that show how that well thought out technology in classes does have a positive impact on adult learning because it lets them access training materials wherever they are. That's like all the research right now on mobile learning is showing that when people can get to their training materials on their phones while they're having downtime, then they're more likely to stay engaged, they're more likely to participate, they're more likely to complete the program. And that in adult learning in general, a sense of community is super important for engagement, and you can build that sense of community with technology. Now, there are probably just as many studies that show that investing in technology for technology's sake makes no sense, like the closets full of smart boards that nobody can use because nobody figured out how to train the teachers how to use them problem. But if there's a strategy behind how the tech's going to get used, then we know that it does make a difference.
Yep. Okay, a couple of more questions as I scroll down here. A couple of people asking about whether or not we're going to, if I'm recording this and we'll post this, and the answer is yes, I answered that. And so a question from Vinod asking, and I think he's asking about your product, are the lessons primarily focused on English speaking, listening, or also on reading, writing, literacy, etc.?
Okay, and then further down, there's actually a question about the technology that we patented to take authentic content and turn it into lessons. And so I'm going to try to answer both of those at once. We have a tool that lets us take authentic content and turn it into lessons. And we do that with a combination of human intervention and natural language processing. So we have licenses to all sorts of authentic content, or we get licenses, or we get real world materials. I mean, I've built workplace training courses for a water pump manufacturer who wanted to have all of the 2020 compliance strategy documents that the employees needed to learn in English, so we turned those into lessons. I have a whole bunch of tugboat workers who are using English, they're learning sea speak with authentic materials that are examples of people like tugboats coming up to each other and other vessels in ports. So we take any piece of content, we take the transcript if it's primarily a spoken or video piece of content, or we take the text itself, we automatically extract all of the keywords in the content that are most relevant for understanding the meaning of the text. And then we generate distractors for all those keywords. And we do all that automatically so that all a teacher needs to do is write some comprehension questions. And that's how we can take content and tag it and offer it to people in a personalized way. So that gets at that question that we had about the tool that we built to develop curriculum. As far as meeting standards, yes, our content meets standards in different ways. So the proficiency tests that we have are aligned to the can-do statements that underpin the Common European Framework and a lot of other language proficiency testing frameworks. And then the materials we use often are educational materials, so they meet whatever standards they're intended to meet. What we do is help people learn to understand them in English. And then there was another question. Yeah, so the activities are aligned. And then as far as reading, writing, listening, speaking goes, we have been trying to build an innovative product that takes advantage of what technology can offer to do those things. Up until now, giving learners automatic feedback on writing and speaking has been outside the scope, especially to non-native speakers, of any sort of automated speech or writing correction. There are too many false negatives and there are too many false positives. So people use the platform to get input practice, to practice reading, practice listening, making sure they understand things, look at models for speaking, look at models for writing, but then the actual authentic writing and speaking practice happens with people. So we teach writing in group classes using shared Google documents where learners will come together and work on writing a work email. A teacher will be there with them in real time, give them feedback, using the chat function to talk about the language. And at the end, they have whatever piece of writing they were working on that they can all then take back and use. People will bring PowerPoint presentations they need to give, letters they want to respond to, and work one-on-one with teachers on those writing and activities, or practice giving speeches, practice talking. All of that's done with teachers because there's no way to replace a teacher in giving somebody corrective feedback on their production. Okay, so there's lots of questions. Should adult ed providers conduct their own needs analysis to better understand their students? Yes, I think so. And I think that that's something that's relatively easily accomplishable with things like a Google Sheet with a survey, or it doesn't have to be like a fancy needs analysis, but any information you can get about your adult learners and what they need to be able to do and how they would measure their own success will help you help them better. Adult education programs are often required to report, yes, on performance approved by the feds, like TABE, yep. Okay, so yes, so does Voxy help instructors and programs understand how Voxy assessments are correlated? We do. So like I said at the beginning of this presentation, I spent the majority of my career either running language courses or as a language teacher. And so I had a lot of people trying to sell me software that made no sense. And one of the things that we have done when we built our product is to make it very configurable and include a needs analysis at the institutional level into the onboarding process. So if we are working with an adult basic education program that's going to be held to those standards, we would figure out what materials you already have, how to prepare students for the test. Actually, my head of curriculum right now, the guy that sets up all of our new partners with their Voxy licenses, came from a workforce development program where he ran the ESL part and the workforce development part. So we're familiar with the standards and how to help people make sure that they have instruction that reinforces what learners need to be able to pass those tests. So I think I talked about the role teachers play. Here's a question: how do you train listening skills, especially the so-called bottom-up listening, being able to decode the different accents? That's a great question. And listening skill, like all the different accents work best, and listening works best when people have practice and when they have exposure to many, many, many examples of authentic input. So what we do is we give learners hundreds of examples of people doing the same tasks with different accents, with different speakers, with different readers. They get the practice they need to be familiar with different accents. Okay, so how do you help providers adjust to and learn this approach? Sometimes their last professional development training was a decade or two ago and may reference approaches to language, for example, that are a bit different from the approaches you advocate. What have you found works well? So yes, that's true. And I found a couple of things work well. One is that when you explain to people that language learning is learning a skill, it intuitively makes sense. And people can often think back to their own language learning experience. Well, I took 4 years of Spanish and I can't say anything. Well, that's true, because in your 4 years of Spanish, you probably learned how to conjugate boot verbs. And you probably learned how to have dialogues that nobody would ever have. And you probably had to learn really complicated rules about when to use the subjunctive and when to use the indicative and when to use stare and a star, and you could fill out grammar sheets, but you couldn't do anything with Spanish. And that's because what you learned was about the language, but you didn't learn how to do anything with it. So what happens with successful language learners is they're often tortured with a program like that, where they learn a lot of things about the language. And then they, if they're lucky, find themselves in a situation where they need to speak the language, and they quickly realize they can't say anything. But if they practice, if they try to listen to what their interlocutor is saying, they eventually make progress. So what I'm advocating for, what we have a lot of research to back up, is that you can skip that whole first step and just have people start learning to use the language and then give them feedback where they're struggling. I'm not saying you don't teach them grammar, but you want to teach them just in time. And this dovetails with a lot of what we know about how people learn to do things. Adults learn by doing. You can talk and talk and talk to adults about how to do things. They might pay attention. It might help them a little bit, but they're not going to learn to do it until they go try to do it themselves. The same thing happens with learning a language. And so how do I convince people? I explain this. I can send research that demonstrates that our approach is effective. I have efficacy data on learners improving their performance. There are other published studies on task-based programs that have been used in workforce development contexts that I can send to. I'm always happy to sit down and talk to anyone about their objections and why they think a more outdated approach would work. But yeah, I try to give webinars like this where I can tell people that this is the way that language learning works best. So this next question, what does Voxy do better than most adult ESL teachers? Okay, Voxy doesn't do anything better than most adult ESL teachers. What Voxy does is it takes the things that are difficult for teachers to do and that good teachers know you need to do and does it for them. So any good classroom teacher who's worked with ESL students knows that your students are going to pay attention if they're reading materials they like. But teachers can't go to the newspaper and copy articles about politics, sports, world news, Beyonce, the Kardashians, like earthquakes, and figure out which of the students in the class want to read which article. But we know that if the student has an article that he or she likes better, they're going to pay more attention to it. Voxy can do that automatically. I have, at this point, 15,000 different pieces of authentic content in our system, tagged for the proficiency level for which it's most appropriate, and also tagged for topic, so I can give learners materials they like, and we know people pay attention to things they like. So we save teachers time. When we're working with a program that already has its own teachers, that's all we do. We offer the authentic input and adaptive activities and personalized instruction and reporting to teachers so they can take what learners are doing outside of class and use it to make class more effective. When we are working with a program that doesn't have any teachers, then we use our own trained staff of teachers who offer virtual instruction, just like I'm doing right now through this Zoom, that's integrated with what learners are doing on the platform. But we would never, ever, ever, ever say we were trying to replace teachers. What we want to do is make instruction more effective by moving the things that teachers spend time on that waste their time out of what teachers are worrying about, and let teachers worry about things like giving people feedback on writing and speaking. Okay, the scaffolding we've built into the input for learners. Now, one of the objections that people often raise about technology-mediated instruction that uses authentic content is that everything's in English. Like, how are the learners going to learn if everything is in English? So we know that learners are going to go translate things. When they're inside of our platform, they have keywords that are glossed in every piece of content that they're seeing, and they can click on those keywords. They can see the definition of the keyword, they can get a translation for the keyword, they can see the keyword in context. That we also have, for every written text, each one's read aloud by a native English speaker, and to get to the question about accents, with a different global English accent. So I have Jamaican readers, Irish readers, Australian readers, readers from the US, so learners can read a text, hear the text read to them, see the keywords, get glosses and translations from the keywords. When we're giving learners videos, they all pause strategically for comprehension questions. Another thing we know about online learning is that if you ask learners to watch a long video, they're going to get up and go fold their laundry and come back, and the video will still be going, and they'll have no idea what happened. So in order to advance through the video instruction we offer, learners have to answer comprehension questions. And we ask them comprehension questions that map to the standards on the Common European Framework, for example. So at the beginning levels, learners are demonstrating that they've understood something. At more advanced levels, learners are making predictions and inferences. Okay, so when we teach directly, for example, home health aides, how do we develop students' digital literacy skills? It's a great question. Voxy was designed as a direct-to-consumer product at first, which means that it doesn't look like a lot of other pieces of educational technology. It's very simple and straightforward to use. When learners first start using it, they get a welcome video, they get a welcome email, they get messages from the system that give them direct links to go in and click on lessons. They get a study plan that they can download. We can give them a welcome message in their native language. And then we offer ongoing learner support. They can get help through live chat. Anybody who has a Voxy license that they get through a sponsoring organization, we have a customer success team that's set up to, I'm sorry, was there a question? A customer success team that's set up to work directly with whoever's sponsoring the program at their institution to make sure that learners know how to use it. So we will go deliver in-person trainings for teachers and for students. We can customize how we do that based on the needs of the organization. But it's really important to us that we measure the outcomes of our programs, which means learners have to be using them, which means that we have multiple different avenues of making sure learners are engaged.
I'm going to just, instead of typing, I'll just ask the question too, because I'm curious. So because you're measuring learner outcomes, are there any sort of overall general things you can talk about in terms of outcomes using technology in language learning? I think you talked a little bit about engagement, but.
That we see, so measuring outcomes, a lot of organizations don't want to report outcomes because there are many reasons why. And so it's difficult to find industry standard benchmarks. However, there are a few different scales of how many hours it takes to reach different levels of proficiency, and we see that we consistently come in under those hours. And I think part of it is that when we measure time on task, we actually measure when learners are actively doing something in the platform. And so it's more efficient. And because our approach to live instruction is to offer targeted, personalized live instruction so learners get help exactly where they need it, we see them make progress more quickly. And this is reflected in the number of hours we see for proficiency gains, and it's also reflected in learners' self-report when they come back and tell us, wow, things like, I don't even need to study, I just go in and I am reading and listening to things that I like, and then I can go do my job better. I mean, I'm not making these up. I have lots and lots of unsolicited feedback from learners about how we're helping them. Okay, my earlier question about strat for helping teachers learn to use the data. Okay, sorry, I thought that I got at that, but first of all, in order to help teachers use data, we want to make sure, like with anything else, that we're giving them data that they want to have. So big spreadsheets and Excel spreadsheets that are just full of numbers that aren't aggregated, that aren't explained, are not useful for teachers, many of whom don't have the training that they need to make sense of what those numbers mean. So we try never to do that. We actually have a reporting system that lets teachers go in and choose the variable they're interested in and generate overview reports of what the learners are doing. And so that's helpful because teachers are in control of the data themselves and they can ask questions. And then we try to deliver reports that answer specific questions, like what percentage of my learners are engaged, what percent are at this level, what percent are struggling with listening skills or reading skills. But we do teacher trainings for anybody who's interested, who's using our platform. And one of the things we talk about is how to use data in the classroom. But in order to work, to make that work, you need to sit down and give teachers examples of their own students and talk about how the data will help them solve problems and let them figure it out like you're doing anything else. Adults learn by doing. People pay attention to things when they're relevant to them. We need to use the same approach when we teach teachers how to use data.
And are you finding that that you can get teachers to use the reports. I mean, this
Yes.
this is true in K-12. This is true across education, that teachers don't often use the reports. There's so much data there, they get overwhelmed and they don't know what to do with it.
Exactly, which is why we've made it super streamlined. And so, yes, we get teachers to use reports because we tailor the reports to what the teachers want. And because they're easy to use. I'll include some screenshots after we're done with the webinar today of what the reporting tool that we built looks like, because we built it based on teacher input. So we talked to administrators and teachers at private language schools and universities all over the world about what they wanted to see and how they wanted to get the data. And then we built the tools around those. Can you access data from the Voxy platform to indicate that teachers at least viewed reports? That's an interesting question. Yes, we can. We have data on everything.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I'm hearing what people are saying here, which is, I'm hearing what you're saying, which is, make it easy for teachers to look at and they'll do it. But there's still the rub, on, kind of what are the other strategies kind of generically outside of your particular product, right? To really help people understand the value of the data and how that's actually going to help them in their teaching,
And I think that's what I was getting at before, which is that teaching teachers how to take data outside of class and use it in the classroom makes them access the reports. Because in a really good flipped classroom where you're bringing in insights from what learners have been doing outside of class into your instruction, then you are definitely looking at the reports and you're using the reports to make what you're doing more effective. And so that's resonated the most. I'm thinking back to a teacher training I did over the summer in Brazil, and that's what got them really excited about the data, was that they could then go and change what happened in the classroom based on what the learners had done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Interesting. Okay, so we're close to the end of time here. Not the end of time, but the end of our time here. I'll see if there's any final questions. If there are, we have just like a minute or two, so hopefully you're typing, or you can unmute yourself and just ask the question. That's fine too. I'll wait for just a second, see if anybody wants to do that. Okay. What I'll definitely do is, yes, it will be, as the last question they're saying, will it be available? So what I'll do is, as a follow-up, we'll send out a link to this webinar and then a couple of resources that Katie will also add here, a couple like links to maybe a couple of her papers and some studies she knows on the subject here. And we'll send that out as a follow-up to anybody who's registered for this webinar, and then feel free to forward that up to, to any of your colleagues, et cetera. Looks like there's one more question.
This is one of my favorites. One of your competitors encourages students by displaying messages like you are now 23% fluent in English. I actually wrote a blog post about this a couple of weeks ago. I understand that it's unhealthy, but what are other ways of encouraging people that you use? So we encourage people by sending them text messages, WhatsApp messages, emails that are automated based on their performance, having their teachers reach out to them, giving teachers information through reports about what students are doing to give them encouragement that's personalized. Like, you have done this many lessons that you need to do, here's another lesson that you need to finish, or it's almost time for you to take another test. So rather than making up a fake metric that doesn't mean anything, we use similar techniques to reach out to learners, but we give them information about what they've actually done and encourage them to keep using the platform.
Nice.
Okay. And I'll skim through the questions after the after this is over and make sure we've answered all of them.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, Katie, for your time. It's been a great, very interesting webinar, and we can tell from all the questions that are here. So, thank you a ton.
Thank you so much to everyone who came, and thank you for having me. It was really fun.
All right. I'm going to stop.